Greetings. Father Mark signing on, continuing the course on medieval church history with the second installment in our unit on the Merovingians. Last time we got up to the successful conclusion, or, well, from the Frankish perspective, the victory, I'll put it that way, the victory of King Clovis, the Merovingian Frank, over the Visigoths in southern France, expanding southern France, Aquitaine, adding that to the Frankish kingdom of Belgium, northern France, part of West Germany, and now at least southwest France, down to the Pyrenees, down south. That war ended in 507, and now we pick up with the year 511, with the first national, it's not a nation state, but the first council, church council in Gaul, present-day France, in the Merovingian period. In what, in the first one in the successor kingdom that is going to become France. It met at Aurelianum, 74 miles southwest of Paris on the Loire River. That's present-day Orléans. 33 bishops attended, approving 31 canons. And King Clovis agreed. I mean, he wasn't there, but he after he did agree. And so the significance of that being that it established a relationship between church and state that endured for the over 2 centuries, that the Merovingians reigned, and the Carolingians who followed continued. They didn't do everything the Merovingians did, but at least they continued this paradigm of church-state relations. And then others followed, so it really endured for centuries and shaped French Catholicism. To set the proper tone, St. Remigius recommended, and Clovis agreed, that the presiding bishop of the council should be from the conquered territory, the newly conquered territory. And so it was. Bishop Cyprian of Bordeaux was allowed to preside. Some examples, I won't go through all the canons, but a few that are essential to know, to understand the medieval church. This council, Clovis agreed to really a breathtaking concession, which he didn't have to do. But he granted legal equality between the Franks and the old imperials, the conquerors and the conquered. Now that differed from other successor kingdoms, the Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, in which the imperials and the overlords had different legal systems. So by this is agreeing. So it's yet in even longer term, it's yet another step toward France becoming a nation. Canons 1, 2, and 3 codified the right of sanctuary in churches and ecclesiastical residences, like monasteries, meaning someone on the run could, seek sanctuary in church, stipulating that the ecclesiastic, whoever was in charge there, did not have to surrender the person seeking sanctuary unless the pursuer would swear on the Gospels that that person would not be injured. Now, that doesn't mean there wouldn't be a punishment. I mean, they might have to pay a fine. They might, there are other things that they could do, but that they would not be mutilated, which was part of the legal. I mean, that could be done. Have an ear chopped off, or an eyes gouged out, tongue pulled out, hand chopped off, or head chopped off, torture. So the ecclesiastic legally was protected and did not have to surrender a person without getting that oath, public oath. Huge concession. Canon 4 wrote into Merovingian law a continuation of the imperial practice of endowing the church with lands. We covered that both in the patristics course and then again in the section on Bede, St. Bede. Though in this case they're referring specifically to, from the newly conquered Visigoth territory of Aquitaine, southwest France, specifying that the revenues were not only to support the church, but were also for the church to manage care for the poor and care for prisoners in the realm. And in exchange for that service, these church revenue would be exempt from taxation. The reasoning being that if the church is providing these services to the realm, then that's in lieu of taxation, because the taxes are to support the realm. So if the church is doing this service, then they'd be exempt. Many Visigoths in the conquered territory were heretics. They were Arian heretics, including the clergy. So Canon 10 of this council established that formerly heretical clerics who repented, made the proper profession of faith as Catholics, could be accepted as Catholic clergy at the discretion of the bishop and according to his own assignment. They might not be able to stay where they were. They just had to accept that. The bishop might send them somewhere else. Or the bishop might say no. But if he wanted to, he could. So it created this mechanism. Canons 14 and 16 reiterated that the church was entrusted with the care for the poor and the sick in the realm. Essentially, the church was put in charge of all social services, as the government did not envision a role for itself in this regard, and really wouldn't for centuries. With regard to monasteries, Canon 19 clarified that abbots were under the authority of the local bishop. That's very carefully worded. So monasteries are not parishes. So like the bishop could not go in the monastery and tell an individual monk, you do this. The way that a bishop could go to a parish and tell the priest in that parish, you do this. But the bishop could, so the abbot of the monastery is under the bishop's authority. So the bishop could tell the abbot, I want your monastery to undertake this, to do this. And then it's up to the abbot to tell, and the abbot had to obey according to this. But then the abbot would decide how to allocate his monks. Like if the bishop said, I want your abbey to, there's this tribe of Thuringians, across the river, and they're pagan, and I want your abbey to take over spreading the gospel to them. So the bishop could not go to the abbey, just show up and say, okay, you 10 monks go to Thuringia. But he could tell the abbot, I want your abbey to undertake this, and then it's up to the abbot to figure out how to do it. Clovis approved, eventually, he approved the decrees of the council, making it both de facto and de jure the first treaty between the Frankish kingdom and the church. Clovis died later the same year, on the 27th of November, 511. Initially, his wife, St. Clotilde, placed his remains in the Abbey of St. Genevieve. Despite all the effort, Clovis expanded. This is unbelievable. There's some parts of history, no matter how, I just never understand. The First World War is one of them, and this is another one. Like after all the effort Clovis expended to reunite Old Roman Gaul and to expand, because he even crossed outside the old empire and went into Germany. Yet at his death, he divided the realm between his 4 sons. I don't know, this is what he did. So, Theuderic I got Austrasia, so his capital was at Metz. Clodomir was the king of Neustria, and he decided that his capital would be at Aurelianum, at Orleans, instead of at Paris. Because Childebert I took Paris, and Clothar became king of Soissons. So it's not even, it's it's just insane. This brought much sorrow, well, to everybody in the realm, but in particular to their mother, Clotilde. She lost her friend Saint Genevieve the following year. Genevieve died in 512. Her feast day is January 3rd, so it's assumed that that's when she died. And Saint Genevieve is still considered patroness of the city of Paris and one of the patrons saints of France. Clotilde established an abbey to house Genevieve's remains and interred her and her late husband in that abbey. Clotilde then commissioned the writing of Genevieve's biography. And then Clotilde left Lutetia. She left Paris and retired to Tours, where she lived in the vicinity of the Abbey of St. Martin in Tours, because there was little of comfort to hold her in Paris. In the year 512, St. Caesarius, whom we met last time, wrote a regula for his sister, who was an abbess of a convent, meaning a Pachomian-style monastery for women. It was entitled the Regula Virginum, the rule for virgins. Significant because it is the first Latin rule composed intentionally and exclusively for women. 523. Clotilde's sons, Clovis's sons, went to war against King Sigismund of Burgundy. He was the son, Sigismund was the son of Uncle Gundobad. You remember from last session that Uncle Gundobad murdered Clotilde's parents. Gundobad was dead, but now Sigismund was king of Burgundy. So Clotilde's sons, now they're all kings themselves, they invade Burgundy, in part seeking revenge for the death of their mother's parents, but also, if they won, then they would divide up Burgundy among themselves. They prevailed in the war. They captured and beheaded Sigismund, his wife, and his children. But his brother, Godemar, survived to continue the war. Godemar now has the obligation of revenge, of vendetta, for his dead brother Sigismund. So Godemar captured Clodomar, who was one of Clovis's sons, and executed him on June 25th, 524. Clodomar was the king of Orleans. He left behind 3 sons. 2 of them were murdered by Uncle Godemar. One escaped. And that one who escaped is the next Merovingian saint that we'll cover, Saint Clodard. Clodoald. Or Saint Cloud in French history, or it's spelled Saint Cloud. And as we'll see, the town is named after him. So Saint Clodard was a Merovingian prince. He was a grandson of Clovis and Saint Clotilde. After all the bloodbath we just covered, and for seminarians, you don't have to remember all those names. The significance is it took place. He survived, and he did not attempt to claim his royal rights. He did not try to get back in the loop to claim the kingdom of Orleans for himself. He renounced all that, and he entered ecclesiastical life. He traveled to Lutetia, Paris, followed the Seine River down 6 miles outside of town until he found a holy man that he had heard about. He was looking for. This guy was named Saint Severin. Saint Severin was living at Novigentum. He took Clotard as a disciple. Together, they worked with the villagers, mostly farmers and fishermen. They traveled for trade to and fro from Paris. And over the years, Severin trained Clotard in religion. 8 years later, at the age of 20, Clotard was accepted formally into ecclesiastical life by the Bishop of Paris. At that point, he was able to visit his grandmother, St. Clotilde, who was still living at the Abbey of St. Martin of Tours. St. Severin died 8 years later, on the 27th of November, 540. He was buried in a place that, at the time, was outside the gates of Paris, on the left bank of the River Seine. But now it's within the city. It's across the river from the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Clotard constructed a shrine over the tomb of his mentor, encouraging those entering or departing Paris to stop there to pray. Over the centuries, several larger churches were built on the site, and today there still is functioning a parish of St. Severin. St. Severin the Solitaire, they call him that, the hermit, which now still serves as a huge active parish serving the southern part of the city of Paris, but below the river. 4 years later, St. Clotilde died at Tours on the 3rd of June, 545, at the age of 71. Clotilde is one of the patron saints of queens, of widows, of brides, of exiles, of the lame, and of women who suffer from bad-tempered husbands. 6 years later, after 19 years as a Benedictine brother, her grandson Clodald was ordained a priest by Bishop Eusebius of Paris in 551. In gratitude to the people of Novigentum for their shelter when he was on the run from his uncles, he constructed a church. It's confusing, but it's also dedicated to St. Martin of Tours. But it's not the St. Martin church that's in Tours. It's dedicated to St. Martin of Tours. But it's in Novigentum, in what was Novigentum. Clodald died there 9 years later, on September 7th, 560, at the age of 38. Miracles at his tomb caused the name of the town to be changed in his honor. Holy Clodald, or Sanctus Clodowaldus. And so that got contracted to St. Cloud, and then in French you don't pronounce the suffix, so it's Saint Cloud. But it remains. On the map it spells St. Cloud, and it's still there. And he's the patron saint of nail makers. 1 year after he died, bringing us to 561, his uncle, St. Clothar I, died. Clothar I was the youngest son of Clovis and St. Clotilde. Clothar was the one who had murdered his three brothers, including St. Clodald's father, because, in the Merovingian way, he wanted to reunite Clovis's realm. He wanted to be the one. He wanted to be the Rex Francorum, the king of the Franks. And he did. He did reunite them. But he died in 561, having united all the realms. But, again, why did they do this? Having seen what happened when Clovis did it, and after all the murdering his brothers and murdering nephews in order to do it, going to war against Burgundy, murdering all those, to reunite it, yet he divides it in his will. It's divided again among his sons. He had 4 sons, so it's divided into 4 pieces again. The first of those sons to die was Dagerbert I. He died in 567. He was reigning as king of Paris for 6 years. until his death. He connects to other material we covered, specifically the life of Pope Gregory the Great and St. Austin, or St. Augustine of Canterbury, in that he negotiated the marriage of his daughter, St. Bertha. So this is King Dagerbert I, or Dagerbert in French, King of Paris, from 561 to 567. His daughter was Eldeberge, or St. Bertha. She's known as St. Bertha. He negotiated the marriage alliance. He married her to the King of Kent in England, whose name was Ethelbert. The marriage took place in 580. Bertha was Catholic. Ethelbert was pagan initially, but part of the deal was she was allowed to practice her faith. And through her influence, King Ethelbert eventually did convert to Catholicism. And she supported really, but the king, didn't get in the way, supported the missionaries sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert the Anglo-Saxon successor kingdoms, which began in 597. And we went into much more detail of that in one of the parts on Gregory the Great. Otherwise, Dagerbert was a very poor exemplar of the faith. He invalidly maintained 4 wives. Well, not really 4 wives. But you know what I mean. He was calling 4 different women his wives, and numerous concubines. Even by the basement standards of Merovingian morality, Dagerbert stands as the first Merovingian king to be excommunicated. Which brings us to the bishop who excommunicated him and is the next Merovingian saint. The thing about the Merovingians, they're so extreme. You have saints, extreme holiness on one side, and then there's these extreme homicidal maniacs, and nothing in between. So the bishop who excommunicated him was the Bishop of Paris, named Saint Germain, or Saint Germanus in Latin. He was born near Autun, that is 197 miles southeast of Paris. Born in 496, in the near the 20th anniversary of the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. His parents were both Gallo-Romans. Discerning a call to Benedictine life, monastic life, he entered the Abbey of St. Symphorian in Autun. He was ordained a priest at the age of 35 to serve as abbot until the Bishop of Paris died in 555. Then he became Bishop of Paris at the age of 59. 2 years later, in 557, St. Germanus hosted a synod in Paris with the support of the king, Childebert I. It was attended by 15 bishops, and it promulgated 10 canons, which reveal some of the problems facing the church in the Merovingian period. Canon 1 condemned the theft of church property. There's already a commandment, thou shalt not steal. Evidently that was insufficient. So they have another one, specifically condemning theft of church property. Canon 4 forbade incestuous marriages, specifying marriages to a brother's widow or to a wife's sister. And that's why he ended up having to excommunicate the king, Dagerbert. Canon 8 stipulated that no secular ruler could impose a bishop on the people. So for seminarians, remember that 557, the Council of Paris, because this is the first inkling we have of what's going to later in the medieval period explode into the investiture controversy. It's one of the many church-state disputes in the medieval period. So later secular rulers are going to try to control and many of them, did, just because they have the guys with swords, control who was going to be bishop. But even later with the investitures, that they would actually give them the symbols of their office, and that that was condemned by the church. But anyway, so here's the first time the church condemns that idea of a secular ruler imposing a bishop on the people. Another focus of St. Germanus' labor was continuing to try to replace the residual pagan practices among the officially Catholic population since Clovis, but the Franks were, pagan. And initially they were pagan, and not everybody converted at the same time. And even those who did convert, catechesis is always a problem. Well, how much could they keep? How much was permissible and how much and what was not. But so that's the work of generations to do that. St. Germanus enjoyed the support of the king in his early years as Bishop of Paris. On December 23rd, 558, he presided over the dedication of a church paid for by King Childebert I. It was a Church of the Holy Cross and St. Vincent the Martyr. It was built to house a relic, the stole of the martyr, St. Vincent. An abbey was constructed nearby, with spiritual and temporal jurisdiction over the neighborhood. And that lasted until the 17th century. So that the neighborhood that grew up around it was called it still is called Saint Germain des Prés, Saint Germanus of the Meadows. Because there's another Saint Germain. This is another part of the city, but this is the one that was. It's not a meadow now, but at the time it was a meadow. The church was rebuilt later in the medieval period and dedicated to Saint Germanus because he's the one that dedicated the church. So it was changed. So instead of the Church of the Holy Cross, it's the Church of Saint Germain. Because by that point he had been canonized by Pope Alexander III. King Childebert I died shortly after St. Germanus dedicated the church, and the king was buried in this church. Childebert was succeeded briefly by his brother, King Clotaire I. The realms were divided once again 3 years later when Clotaire died in 561 among his surviving sons, one of whom was Sigebert I. He got Austrasia, the East Frank kingdom. He was the third son of Clotaire I, and he reigned in Austrasia for 14 years, from 561 until 575. Within that period of his reign, in 567, 6 years into his reign, Sigebert married a Visigoth princess from Spain named Brunhilda. The Visigoths at the time were Arian heretics, and they remained so until the Third Council of Toledo in 589, which we covered in the unit on St. Isidore of Seville. So I won't repeat all that. Just that Brunhilda was a heretic, but she agreed to become Catholic in order to marry into the Merovingian royal family and to become queen of Austrasia, of the Eastern Reich. She bore Sigebert 3 children, including a future king, Childebert II. The following year, 568, Sigebert's brother, Chilperic I, king of Soissons, married Brunhilda's sister, Galswintha. This marriage of Chilperic to Galswintha was unacceptable to Chilperic's mistress, Fredegund. Fredegund employed a gray man, or a shadow man, an assassin, never identified, never captured, to murder Galswintha by garroting. So that's strangled, murder her by strangling. Since Chilperic immediately after Galswintha's death then married Fredegund, his mistress, Galswintha's sister Brunhilda correctly deduced that Fredegund was responsible for the murder of her sister, though it couldn't be proven. Brunhilda, who's married to Sigebert, the king of Austrasia, and Fredegund, now married to Chilperic, the king of Soissons, persuaded their husbands to go to war with each other. Now, those two guys are brothers. Of course, that didn't matter for Merovingians because that, fraternal, or I guess, fraternal homicide. That was a Merovingian thing. But persuaded them to go to war with each other, thereby dooming yet another generation of Merovingians to drown in blood. Here is how St. Gregory, the Bishop of Tours, described living through this nightmare. And he was ideally positioned to know. Tours lay on the watery highway of the Loire River, 127 miles southwest of Paris. 5 Roman roads radiated out from Tours, which lay on the main thoroughfare between the Frankish north and Aquitaine in the south. So in Book 5, the introduction to Book 5 of his history, St. Gregory of Tours wrote, quote, I am weary of relating the details of the civil wars that mightily plagued the nation and the kingdom of the Franks. And the worst of it is that we see in them the beginning of that time of woe which the Lord foretold. Father shall rise against son, son against father, brother against brother, literally in this case, kinsman against kinsman. They should have been deterred by the examples of former kings who, slain by their enemies as soon as they were divided. How often has the very city of cities, the great capital of the whole earth, been laid low by civil war? That's Rome. And when it ceased, has risen as if from the ground. Would that you too, O kings, were engaged in battles like those in which your fathers struggled, that the heathen, terrified by your union, might be crushed by your strength. Remember how Clovis won you great victories, how he slew opposing kings, crushed wicked peoples, and subdued their lands, and left you complete and unchallenged dominion over them. And when he did this, he had neither silver nor gold, such as you now have in your treasuries. What is your object? What do you seek? What have you not already in plenty? In your homes there are luxuries in abundance. In your storehouses wine, grain, and oil abound. Gold and silver are piled up in your treasuries. One thing you lack. Without peace, you have not the grace of God. Why does one take from another? Why does one desire what another has? I beg of you, beware of this saying of the apostles. But if you bite and devour one another, take heed that you not be consumed one of another. Examine carefully the books of the ancients, and you will see what civil wars beget. Read what Erosius wrote of the Carthaginians, who said that after 700 years, their city and country were ruined, and adds, what preserved this city so long? Unity. What destroyed it after such a period? Disunity. Beware of disunion. Beware of civil wars, which destroy you and your people. What else is to be expected but that your army will fall, and that you will be left without strength, and be crushed, and be ruined by hostile peoples? And, king, if civil war gives you pleasure, govern that impulse, which the apostle says is urgent within man. Let the spirit struggle against the flesh, and the vices fall before the virtues. And be free, and serve your King, who is Christ, you who were once a fettered slave of the root of evil. In a desperate effort to avert this outcome, Bishop Germanus of Paris reached out to the other surviving brother, Guntram, who was king of Burgundy, asking that the brother invite the disputants, the two brothers, Sigebert and Dagerbert, to allow he, the bishop, Germanus, to mediate the dispute. Since Germanus was Gallo-Roman, with no familiar relationship to either the Franks or the Visigoths, and he had an impeccable reputation for honesty and simplicity of life, so, he wasn't going to accept bribes. He thought it was worth a try. It might be acceptable. And the antagonists agreed. They agreed to allow Germanus to mediate. In 569, after hearing all sides, Bishop Germanus decided that Brunhilde was entitled to Wergild. Wergild just means man price. So under Frankish Celtic law, Salian Frank law, monetary compensation in place of other punishment was acceptable. So it was a man price, a money price, instead of a blood price. Because if she wanted to exact blood price, the eye for an eye, life for a life, then that means war. And the Wergild was a recognized part of their law. That someone who committed murder could pay compensation to the family and would not be executed or anything. Okay, so what's it going to be? How much? What do you put in how many gold pieces is Brunhilde's sister's life worth? So the bishop's solution was that the Wergild would consist of Galswintha's dowry, and that would be given to Brunhilde as Wergild. And that meant, so when Galswintha was murdered, her dowry stayed with her husband, Chilperic, which means Chilperic and Fredegund would have to give it back. They would have to give it to Brunhilde, which is a tacit admission that they accepted that they owed Wergild, which means it was admitting that they were guilty. Ostensibly, they agreed. But then they looked at what exactly was in Galswintha's dowry, and it included the city of Bordeaux, the wealthy city. And, of course, they're not going to give that up. So this amounted to a temporary ceasefire. It was not a long-term peace. Sigebert and Brunhilde on one side would not let it go, and they continued demanding the Wergild. So Chilperic and Fredegund on the other side realized that we're going to have to fight eventually, and they chose to pick their own time to do a surprise attack. So Chilperic is the one who breached the peace of St. Germanus in 575, with a surprise attack against Austrasia, the Osterreich, the Eastern Reich. As it happened, Sigebert, even though he was a surprise attack, Sigebert outgeneraled his brother, Chilperic, and defeated him. Chilperic managed to survive. He fled the battlefield. That's the only way he survived. He fled all the way to Tournai in Belgium to hide. But Sigebert pursued him. On the way, Sigebert was assassinated, maybe by the same gray man, by the same one who killed Galswintha, because he was never caught. But whoever he was, or they, it might have been more than one. But Sigebert was killed on the road. This time stabbed. He wasn't garroted. And Fredegund did this to save her husband, Chilperic. Once again, Bishop Germanus attempted to mediate peace. But now Brunhilde, that she had lost her sister, now she lost her husband to this pair, to Chilperic and Fredegund. So it was going to be war. And St. Germanus died the following year, anyway, on May 28th, 576. Before Sigebert's murder, Sigebert and Brunhilde had 3 children, including the next king, Childebert II. He succeeded his father as king of Austrasia in 575, and he reigned for the next 20 years. When his uncle Guntram died without living heirs, Childebert inherited that kingdom as well. So at the end, he had two of the Merovingian kingdoms. Chilperic I, who's the husband of Fredegund, he survived because she had Sigebert assassinated. He was still the king of Neustria of the Western Reich. He was stabbed to death by assassins in September of 584 while hunting 11 miles east of Paris. Now, whether Brunhilde paid the assassins or, these people were not well liked, so it could have been, plenty of people had reasons to not like these people. So we don't know if Brunhilde did it or not, but anyway, he was killed. Two of his children with Fredegund died, predeceased him, but his son did survive, and he's the one that became King Clothar II of Neustria, the Western Reich. In 592, that's what I said, Guntram died, and so Childebert succeeded as king of Burgundy. He immediately made war on Clothar II of Neustria, Chilperic's son by Fredegund, because he has to, avenge all, so the vendetta cycle just keeps going. Fredegund, astonishingly, managed to die of natural causes on December 8th, 597, in Paris. Her old antagonist Brunhilde was not so fortunate. Fredegund's son, Clothar II, king of Neustria, captured her in 613. He, I can't really go into details. I'll just say that he put her on the rack, and they kept her alive for 3 days, torturing her on the rack, and then she was still alive. So he had her executed by dismembering, tied her to horses, and had them literally pull her apart. 2 years earlier, in 611, we meet another saint, another Merovingian saint. So you see, we have these extremes, the psychopaths and the saints. This was Saint Arnulf, Arnulf. He became Bishop of Metz, Metz, which, remember, is the capital of Austrasia, the Eastern Reich, which includes Belgium and all the way over into Western Germany. His life establishes the link between the Merovingian dynasty and its successor, the Carolingian dynasty. And the Carolingian dynasty is going to be Charlemagne. And he's the one who would revive the empire. He'd be the first Holy Roman Emperor. So we've already met Dagerbert I, king of Paris, a grandson of Clovis, through his longest surviving son, Clothar I. One of Dagerbert's daughters was named Blithhild, or Blithhilda. She married a descendant of the old imperials. She married a Gallo-Roman named Ansbertus, or Ansbertus, maybe it's Ansbertus. One of their sons was named Arnold. Arnold served as Bishop of Metz from 601 until his death in 611. He was followed as Bishop of Metz by his son, Saint Arnulf. Now, at the time, celibacy was mandatory only for monks and nuns, so there's no scandal with this. Additionally, Arnulf entered ecclesiastical service late in life, He and his wife both, his wife entered a convent, that's just this what they did. Arnulf was born near Nancy in Lorraine around 582 to a family that owned numerous fiefs, very fertile soil, between the Moselle and the Meuse River. Initially designated by his family for secular service in the Merovingian world, Arnulf was trained as a soldier to serve the king Dagerbert II, the king of Austrasia, the Eastern Reich. Earning a reputation for achievement and ability on and off the battlefield, Arnulf worked in 6 provinces before being raised to the position of duke, at the time a senior military command. He was entrusted with defending the border formed by the 220-mile-long river Scheldt that flows through northern France, western Belgium, and the southwestern Netherlands before entering the North Sea. In 596, his family married him to Doda. She was the daughter of another important Frankish house. They had a son named Clodulf of Metz. He does not enter our story, but their second son does. Ansegisel. It's Ansegisel. His father, Arnulf, married him off to Beja. She was the daughter of Pepin of Landen. Landen is a place in Belgium. Pepin is Pepin. He's considered Pepin the First. He was never a king, but just in the genealogy, this is an ancestor of the Carolingians. That's why I'm spending time on this. The name Pepin, for reasons that escape me, that name kept recurring in the genealogy. So in the genealogies, he's Pepin the First. So, all right, get this. All right, Arnulf's son married Pepin's daughter. Right. Through her, Arnulf is the great-grandfather of Charles Martel. Charles Martel was the grandfather of Charlemagne. So this is how ultimately this is the connection between the Merovingians and the Carolingians. So the Carolingians are considered a separate dynasty for reasons that we'll see in a future session. But there is some intermarriage, there is some connection and some continuity between the two. When his father died in 611, Arnulf was ordained a priest, then Bishop of Metz. Though he continued serving as a counselor, sometimes steward, sometimes ambassador, for the Merovingian monarchs of Austrasia. From this position, he witnessed the civil war that I just described between Fredegund and Brunhilde, which ended with the dismemberment of the latter in 613. 10 years later, in 623, the son of Clothar II, Clothar II died, and his son became king of Austrasia. This king's name was Dagerbert I. Arnulf continued serving Dagerbert I, and he was well known, so easily maneuvered his son-in-law, Pepin of Landen, Pepin I, into the position of mayor of the palace of Austrasia. Significant, well, you already know the significance of the office of mayor of the palace, but Pepin is the first of the Carolingians to hold that office, mayor of the palace. And now many of the descendants would also hold it, and it's from that position that a descendant of Pepin of Landen, whose name was also Pepin, his descendant, would overthrow the Merovingians and make himself the first king, the first Carolingian king of the Franks. But we have a while to get there. In 628, Arnulf retired to a monastery where he died. His feast day is July 18th. He is the patron saint of those who brew beer. Also, one story from his life includes the first mention of a bishop's ring as a symbol of office. It doesn't mean he's the first. I mean, it might have been used by previous bishops, but it's something he did. I won't repeat it, but it's something in his life. It just happens to mention that he had a bishop's ring. When Arnulf retired in 628, Dagerbert I was in his 5th year as king of Austrasia. 8 years later, in 638, he ordered construction of a basilica church to house the relics of Saint Denis, Saint Denis. And it would serve from his point on. He would eventually be buried in it. And from that point on, it would serve as the necropolis, or the cemetery of French kings. So remember, I told you we'd come back to this. Remember, at the time, the relics of Saint Denis were still in the church constructed by Saint Genevieve earlier in our story, circa 475. King Dagerbert had that original church replaced with a larger basilica. A basilica refers to a large-style old imperial public building, which is essentially a cruciform-shaped church. He endowed a Benedictine abbey, created a Benedictine abbey and attached to it to care for it. Construction of this new Basilica of Saint Denis brings another saint into our story, Saint Eligius, or Saint Eloi in French history. Eligius, or Eloi, was another Gallo-Roman, but of a different class. The ones we met before, patrician descendants, but he was not. Born in a village of Chapelay, which 6 miles north of Limoges. That's in southwest France, in Aquitaine. Eloi early demonstrated high manual dexterity. So his father apprenticed him to the goldsmith, Abbo, who was in charge of the mint in Limoges. And he finished his apprenticeship, became a master. After becoming a master metalworker, Eloi traveled to the kingdom of Neustria, where he was hired by Babbo. Babbo was the royal treasurer of the kingdom. Later, Eloi, well, I'll say this first, before that happened. Babbo was impressed. Of course, it's skilled labor, so he's, okay, show me what you can do. He was very impressed, so gave him work. And he always did well. He was just one of those who he was very talented. So when the king, King Clothar II of Neustria, expressed a desire to have a magnificent throne, but he didn't know anybody skilled enough to do it. Well, Babbo knew that Eloi could do it. So Eloi got the commission, and the result, the throne he created, far exceeded the king's expectations: gold, jewels, everything. And once displayed, of course, everybody wanted a chair like that. I mean, if you have to sit down, might as well be on a gold chair. And if you can afford a gold chair, why not encrust it with jewels? Well, I mean, Merovingian world, life is short, so. Eligius got more commissions after this. He was commissioned to decorate the tomb of St. Germanus, the late bishop we met, as well as a church of St. Genevieve. Now, he didn't build it, it was already there, but he added some decorations in there. And after which, King Clothar made him master of the mint, to oversee the coinage, creating the coinage. He used his position, Eligius did, used his position of influence to further the Christian mission. He devoted particular attention to freeing slaves who were brought to the port of Marseille, Massalia then, but now Marseille, the port on the Mediterranean. For sale. I mean, there's a slave market there, so they're brought for sale. He established Columban-style Celtic monasteries for men and women. He freed by raising the Freikaufe for them. So some may have had families to go home to, but some of these people may have come from other lands, been captured by pirates, had no way of getting home. So rather than just free him and then just say, okay, good luck on the street, he created these monasteries and convents so they could live a life. Here is how a contemporary describes his care for these people, quote, "Religious men from all parts came to him, foreigners also and monks, and in whatever way he could serve, he would either give them the money or share the price of the captives, for he had the greatest enthusiasm for this kind of work. Indeed, whenever he understood that a slave was being offered for sale, he hastened with the utmost speed in his mercy and immediately gave the price and freed the captive. Occasionally, he redeemed from captivity at the same time as many as 20, 30, or even 50. Sometimes even the whole body of slaves, up to 100 souls, coming from various peoples and of both sexes. He would free as they left the ship. There were Romans, Gauls, and Britons also, and men of Marseille. But they were chiefly men of Saxony, who at that time in large numbers, like flocks, were expelled from their own lands and scattered in different countries." Additionally, Eligius obtained the king's permission to establish a special ministry to take down the bodies of executed criminals and provide them a decent burial without cost to the families, as opposed to just, letting animals eat them. For a time, his monasteries were known as places of skilled craftsmanship that secured protection from local thugs in exchange for their products. Eventually, the young men they trained developed an astonishingly high level of talent, for the 6th and 7th centuries, which manifested in coming generations in really stunning pieces of art. Now, the Merovingian architecture, it was very debased, but their sacred art, the chalices, crucifixes, candlesticks, manuscript illuminations, were of very high quality, and and many survive. After the death of Clothar in 629, Dagerbert appointed Elwar as his chief counselor. Eligius continued to live according to the strict Irish monastic rule of St. Columbanus rather than Benedict's rule. Besides the monasteries he founded, he saw to the endowment of a convent at Solignac near Limoges in 632. Under an abbess named Aurea, 300 nuns lived according to the Irish rule and contributed their labor to his many causes. Further, he built the Basilica of St. Paul, and he restored a basilica at Paris that was dedicated to St. Martial, he had a devotion to St. Martial because St. Martial was the patron saint of his hometown of Limoges. As I said, in 636, King Dagerbert replaced the shrine of Saint Denis built by Saint Genevieve with a new and larger church and built a whole new Benedictine abbey of Saint Denis to honor the relics and care for pilgrims. Eligius created the reliquary to serve as the saint's tomb. When Dagerbert died, he became the first king buried in the church, which set the precedent for the church being the king's cemetery until the French Revolution. So here is a surviving text of King Dagerbert's endowment of Saint Denis, which is, explains, how feudalism is, we talked about it to Saint Bede, how feudalism worked and how the church was, integrated into that structure. Quote, Dagerbert, king of the Franks, illustrious monarch, to Vondelbert, the duke. Whatever we have devoutly granted for the relief of the poor, we believe we shall have returned to us with profit in the next life. Therefore be it known that we have exchanged our villa, called Saclas, situated on the river June, in the district of Étampes, in which we have received from the Lord Ferriol, bishop of the diocese of Autun, and from Abbot Deodatus, the clergy and the church and basilica of Symphorium, in whose care it is known to have been, for another villa called Amica, which is in the district of Marseille, to the increase of our fortune. And that same Saclas, which we have devoutly granted in its entirety to the monks of Saint-Denis, the martyr, at the monastery where his precious body now rests, being within their gates. Therefore we have ordered that from the present date they shall possess the villa of Saclas, with its houses, its serfs, its bondsmen, its woods, its meadows, its pastures, its mills, its flocks, its shepherds, wholly and entirely, just as it was formerly held by the Church of Autun and Symphorium, until we, as has been said, exchanged it for another. Therefore, because it has been granted of our bounty for the salvation of our soul to the monks of Saint-Denis, according to God's will, neither the abbot nor any other person shall at any time presume to destroy this gift to the monks. But let it be administered in the name of God by the hand of their abbot, in whose assiduous care the monks live. And in whatever way the fisc can augment its aid to the poor, let it do so, so that they and their successors may delight in the stability of our kingdom and pray for the salvation of our soul. And that this charter may endure for all time, we have decreed that it be signed with our signature. Ursin obtained it, Dagerbert granted it, given on the 28th of July in the 14th year of our reign, in Clichy. Amen. And it did endure for the entirety of the French monarchy. It was sacked, it was pillaged during the French Revolution. But the building, much of the building, I mean, the remains of the kings were all, desecrated. The relics were all stolen in the Revolution. But it lasted until then, until the monarchy was overthrown. 6 years later, in 642, St. Eligius was appointed Bishop of Noyon-Tournai, 60 miles north of Paris. Even though still canonically, he was still just a brother, a monastic brother, so he had to be rapidly given the next tonsure and holy orders. This Noyon, later Charlemagne, received his first royal coronation in the cathedral of that diocese later. Not his coronation as emperor, that took place at St. Peter's in Rome, but his first crowning as king, the Regnum Francorum, the king of the Franks, took place in that cathedral. Eligius died there at his post on December 1st, 660, and was buried there at Noyon. He is the patron saint of goldsmiths, of blacksmiths, of all workers in metal, patron saint of cattle and horses. His feast is December 1st. In 640 A.D., 2 years before Eligius was ordained a bishop, Pepin of Landen, Pepin I, died. The two knew each other, Eligius and Pepin, and worked together in the service of King Dagerbert. An ancestor of Charlemagne, this Pepin I was born in Landen, Belgium, served as mayor of the Palace of Austrasia under the Merovingian king Dagerbert I, and again under the king Sigebert III, until his death. We met him earlier, having formed a marriage alliance between his daughter Beja and the son of Arnulf of Metz. And as we said, she was Charles Martel's grandfather through her son, Pepin II. So now we meet him. Pepin II was the father of Charles Martel, who we'll meet later. But Pepin II, he's sometimes called Pepin of Heristal, Herstal, because that's where he was born. It's another place in Belgium. Born in 635. He became mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, just like his father, in 680, in service to King Theuderic III of Austrasia. In the course of one of the endless internal Merovingian wars, Pepin of Herstal attacked and subjugated Neustria and Burgundy in the name of his king, the King of Austrasia, by 687. As his reward, he was given additional titles. He was already mayor of the palace, but he was also given the title Dux et Princeps Francorum, Duke and Prince of the Franks. The wife of Pepin II was named Plectrude. She was from a wealthy family of Cologne. They had 2 children, Drogo and Grimold. Drogo was appointed a duke, but died in 708 while his father was still alive. Grimold was appointed mayor of the Palace of Neustria in 695, at, of course, the connivance of his father, who was serving as mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, giving them operational control of 2 Merovingian kingdoms. So Pepin II's wife was named Plectrude. His mistress was named Alpaida. She was a Frankish noblewoman from the Liège area, present-day Belgium. She gave him 2 more children, including Charles Martel, significant because Charles Martel is the grandfather of Charlemagne. Pepin II died in December of 714. His son Grimold was assassinated in the same year, because the 8th century was not a safe place, leaving the position of mayor of the palace vacant in both Neustria and Austrasia, the western realm and the eastern realm. Pepin's wife, Plectrude, applied her money and her family connections to secure the position of mayor of the Palace of Neustria for Grimold's son, her grandson. His name was Theudald. As Theudald was only 6 years old, and she wants him recognized as mayor of the palace, it was obvious that, she planned to function as mayor of the palace and just have him have the name. This, of course, this was not acceptable to many of the Merovingian nobility, so this was followed by the customary Merovingian bloodbath, with factions of nobility backing different Merovingians as kings to be their figureheads so they would exercise real power. Lothar IV of Austrasia, Chilperic II of Neustria, Clothar IV of Austrasia, Dagerbert III of all the Franks eventually, and Theuderic IV, who next was king of all the Franks. Following the kaleidoscope of carnage in this period would not advance our purpose, so we'll rather focus on connecting a few important figures who survived, connected with material we've covered previously, in order to establish a foundation for what is to come. Connecting with previous units. Dagerbert III became king of all the Frankish realms in the year 711. That is the same year that Islam invaded Spain. Remember, we covered that in the unit on Islam. 3 years later, in 714, the same year that Charles Martel's father, Pepin II, died, Charles Martel had a son, and he chose that same name, Pepin, named his son Pepin to honor his father. So this child is known as Pepin the Short. Because of his later habit as an adult, he kept his hair short, which was quite the thing. I mean, among the Merovingians, the long hair was the norm. I mean, to have your hair cut was a disgrace, for a Merovingian warrior. So Pepin just, for whatever reason, he just kept it short. And that would set the trend for the dynasty he would establish, because this Pepin the Short is the one who's going to overthrow the Merovingians and become the first Carolingian king. So the Carolingian style then shifted to short hair. Pepin the Short Hair is the father of Charlemagne, the man who... so Pepin would be the first Carolingian king. Charlemagne would also be king, but Charlemagne would also escalate by becoming the first Holy Roman Emperor. The following year, 715, on April 9th, the Pope died, Pope Constantine. We covered him in the section on St. John Damascene. He was ethnically Greek, and he was the last of the popes to visit Constantinople. I mean, they didn't know that at the time that he would be the last, but in retrospect, he was the last one to visit while Pope, while the Byzantine Empire endured. He was followed as Pope 89 by Saint Gregory II. Saint Gregory was born in Rome of the old patrician class, so he's descended from the imperials. Like the first Pope Gregory, this one, Gregory II, was an ardent supporter of monasticism, having turned his family mansion into a Pacomian monastery under the patronage of St. Agatha, following the Benedictine rule, as Gregory I had done with his estate, turning it into a monastery under the patronage of St. Andrew, also following the Benedictine rule. In the year, let's see, connecting this, the next year, 716, the Islamic conquest of the Iberian Peninsula continues. They conquered Lisbon, which was then part of Galicia, then it became Portugal. The following year, 717, the guy we met in the section on John Damascene became emperor, Byzantine Emperor Leo III. He's the one that's going to start iconoclasm. The same year, 717, one of the Visigoth warriors in Spain who was captured at the defeat of the Guadalete River and enslaved by the Muslims in 711. In 717, 6 years later, he escaped slavery. This guy's name was Pelayo. And he fled to the north, hid out in the foothills of the Pyrenees, survived the harsh winter. He was alone, hunted, but he started causing trouble for the Muslims. You know, just cutting throats, setting fires, hamstringing horses, poisoning water, just doing whatever he could to make life difficult for them. And in that way, he became an outlaw. He eluded capture many times. He became something of a folk hero, and he gathered followers around him. And so he started the reconquest of Spain, like the Spanish King Arthur. In 718, the following year, 300 others like him, fugitives like him, elected him king of all that was left of Spain, which was Cantabria, essentially up in the north. Across the Pyrenees, in Aquitaine in southern France, in the same year, 718, the Duke of Aquitaine, Duke Odo, appears in the story. He raised an army as an ally of King Chilperic II of Neustria, because King Chilperic offered to recognize him, Odo, as Rex Aquitania, as King of Aquitaine. They, together, they fought against the Austrasian mayor of the palace, Charles Martel. And he just outgeneraled him. I mean, he just, they lost badly at a battle at Soissons later that year. And they made peace in exchange for payment. You know, Charles, he made him pay. And to connect this with another previous unit, in the same year, 718, St. Boniface, the future apostle to these people in Germany, visited Rome. And we devoted a whole unit to him on that. So I just want to place him in the context, and we'll mention a few other things he did to fit him with the Merovingians and the the other Merovingian saints we've covered, as well as the Merovingian political establishment, laying the foundations for the Carolingian Renaissance that would follow. The next year, 719, Charles Martel, the mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, invaded the territory of the West Frisians. That's in the Netherlands. On the map, there's still Friedland in the Netherlands is still there. So he added that to Austrasia, to the Eastern Frankish Reich. He's doing all this in service to the figurehead king, Theuderic IV. The following year, 720, is the lead up to the Battle of Tours, which Charles Martel won. And that's going to connect back, we alluded to this in the section on Islam. It was part of the expansion of Islam outside of the Arabian Peninsula, which began in 632. Well, Muhammad died in 632. The expansion outside began 2 years later in 634. And so it continued all of North Africa, Spain, and into France. So that's going to be next. So the year 720 is the next phase when Islam moves into southern France. So we'll pause there and then pick up with that next time. For the moment, thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.